Yeah, and I'm in my early 60s. I was interacting with really gifted Americans who were very disturbed about nuclear energy. For example, I think I met Michio Kaku in 1982, so I was just 21. I worked with Norman Cousins, who of course was a speechwriter for President Kennedy. But Norman was really one of the principal effective messengers and individuals trying to guard us from the bomb. He was trying to ban nuclear bombs. And what I noticed about those two individuals, for example, is they would never mention extraterrestrials. I think it was because they were afraid to combine a discussion of the nuclear menace, as it were, with the fact that that's why we were being visited. And they would go out of their way. If I would say something to either of them, like, what do you think about the extraterrestrial situation? They would not address it. Now, maybe they were just trying to avoid damage to their public reputations, because there was always that sort of snarky, sarcastic response to the ET question, like on the evening news. But I don't think that's it. I think that they would get very concerned about the fact that we were being visited, but we were being visited for a reason. And that is that the extraterrestrials were trying to get our government to ban the bomb and ban nuclear energy, because as the one said to me, it was creating holes in space. That cannot be innocent, and that cannot be a happy idea. So we're talking about brilliant individuals. I mean, Norman Cousins, the physicist Michio Kaku. But I noticed just as a college student in my 20s that they would not go there. There was some connection between extraterrestrials and the nuclear menace that they didn't want to conjoin in the discussion because of what that meant. And I think that Richard Dolan, for example, recently addressed it. Finally, a major ufologist acknowledged that that was what many of these brilliant Americans had been avoiding for all these years, that we were being visited because...
Yeah, let me underline...
concerned about nuclear energy and nuclear bombs.
Yeah, let me interrupt, though, to say something I hope positive to you. You also are a serious and well-respected ufologist among other areas. So you talking about this today shows that there may be an entire group of physicists, politicians, and so on and so forth, who are, I don't want to say they're afraid to come forward, but I can't think of a better word. There's so much that can be done to a person today through social media, to state one, and of course the 24-hour news cycle, that a person's reputation could be seriously damaged within a matter of a few hours.
Well, consider the fact that...
I'm not supporting their possible motives, but I was just pointing it out.
Well, consider the fact that there's always been calls for disclosure. There hasn't been any calls for acknowledging the nexus between extraterrestrials and the nuclear menace. In other words, the calls for disclosure, by keeping that secret, could be a second-level cover-up. I think in some ways it is. Certainly, if the defense departments of the major powers play this game of not admitting that we're being visited by extraterrestrials, while they string that out and prevent quote-unquote disclosure, they're going to succeed at keeping a lid on the fact that we've been visited by extraterrestrials because of the nuclear menace. And I think that has occurred, in fact. So I would give I would give disclosure a new meaning. Let's force the governments of the world to acknowledge or to disclose the nexus between extraterrestrial visitations to Earth and the nuclear menace of Earthlings, namely ourselves. I think that has always been the issue, and that as long as people make these calls for disclosure, they're actually solidifying or making possible the cover-up of the reason of why we're being visited. And I was just lauding Richard Dolan for coming forward a couple months ago among major world ufologists. It has to be stated. Why would somebody as august and articulate and intelligent and connected to one of our most valorous presidents, JFK, namely Norman Cousins, why would I know him and work with him and he would not touch the extraterrestrial question? He even had a picture in his office at UCLA where he took a photograph where he was looking across a body of water, and these youths, human youths, were nonetheless upside down on the surface of the water. I said to him, what do you think of the extraterrestrial situation? And instead of just giving me an answer, Norman pointed to this photograph on his wall in his office in the Factor building at UCLA. And he said, did I show you this? And I said, yeah, they're upside down. They should be in the opposite direction. He said, yeah. And that's all he said. I kind of took it as he was saying that we were sort of, in meeting extraterrestrials, we were seeing ourselves, or they were from another dimension. But he was always evasive about the subject of extraterrestrials. And I think he just didn't want to create a nexus. He didn't want to conjoin the nuclear menace that he made his career out of fighting and the extraterrestrial situation. It was like verboten. It was one of those rails of American politics that was never being mentioned. So I really think we've been, in a sense, deceived about the calls for disclosure. There was never a call for saying, why are the extraterrestrials coming here? From either deep space or another dimension, which they may very well be doing, just sort of spinning into our dimension with their ships. Why are they coming? Who are they? What do they want? And why are they coming? I think that would have revealed the nuclear connection, and the major defense departments of the major world powers that were nuclear powers were not coming clean with the people of the world. That literally either as advanced or more advanced life forms as our own, humanoids from other places, were saying, you've got to stop blowing up nuclear weapons and even sponsoring nuclear power. But I think they've kind of curtailed or limited the discussion of why the ETs are coming, because it was going to invalidate their nuclear activities. I mean, blowing up, what has it been, about 80 years since the end of World War II? Over 2,000 nuclear bombs? That cannot be, nothing. That cannot be irrelevant.
Let me interrupt for a second. There are some other possibilities, though. I mean, for example, the first thing I wanted to say was that it could be that the general public is being spoon-fed. Like, it's only been literally in the last, 16 months that you can talk about a flying saucer or a UFO without a smirk on someone's face. But perhaps it's going to take another, who knows how long, before people will even accept the idea that someone is probably flying those things and is in them. And so this thing about making a connection between the beings and our nuclear program is probably too far-fetched now for them. When I say them, I'm talking about the government agencies, because they would have to start out by admitting to the public that they've always known about the extraterrestrials or space beings or whatever you want to call them. And I don't think they're ready for that.
But Bruce, what I'm saying is they've engaged in meme management.
I agree with you, incidentally. You know this.
Architecting of the disclosure movement, what disclosure means.
Right. I mean, I would like to have Stephen Greer on the show if I could get in touch with him, because from my point of view, he was one of the first people to really set this disclosure stuff in serious circumstances where government agencies actually met with him and were willing to talk about it. But that's
an interesting figure. I met him in 1980.
Okay.
I was then 18, and he was in his mid-20s.
Right.
And he was identified to Brett Stillings and I when we were at College of the Siskiyous in Weed, California, in our Mars training class. And we met about 5 older guys who were having lunch in the eatery there. And they identified themselves as all CIA. So I have to aver and say that you have to remember that Steve Greer has been identified as career CIA. So you're really dealing with profound meme management when the heroes of disclosure are actually working for the intelligence agencies of the United States. Now, I'm not saying that Steve hasn't sort of forged a somewhat potentially independent career, because he could have done what I did, which is break away from the U.S. government to tell the truth. That's quite possible if you look at his involvement in the disclosure conference at the National Press Club in May of 2001. So I'm not going to take away credit from somebody when he's earned their, or she has earned their props on breaking away from the government and trying to accomplish disclosure. But it's not just really limited to Steve Greer. Almost the whole field has been meme managed to give disclosure a non-nuclear menace type of explanation, when I think that is the reason that we've been visited. I mean, we've been visited for thousands of years, but the thing that defines the post-war overflights and abductions and so forth is the world became a nuclear reality.
Right. And I mean, you're not the first person to talk about this. As I said before, we've talked about Al Bielek, and not that he's the only one, but the idea is that there are a lot of people who have been talking about the possibilities of the time-space continuum being affected by radiation from nuclear, well, not just nuclear bombs, but from all different types of experimentation using high radiation and even electromagnetic forces, like what was purported to have happened during the Philadelphia experiment.
Yes, and the evidence starting to really be being collected by university professors and staff members. There have been many incidents in which people have been working on projects and they've gone to lunch or whatever, and their work has been totally not where they put it. So there's been very bright, programmatically directed researchers at the university level. I had such an experience. I was working on a planning project with 2 professors at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo in their planning department. And where we had put the paperwork to write the planning study we're working on was put somewhere that could not have, apparently not been put there by us, but none of us put it there. In other words, we've got really bright, creative people who have found their work totally where they didn't put it. Presupposing that nobody came into their department and played a game like that with their works, how did it get to a new location? Again, it's that pattern of the time-space continuum being changed.
So the manipulation that we're talking about here, you believe, is caused by the experimentation.
I believe that radiation is the issue.
Right.
That both detonating nuclear bombs and maintaining nuclear power plants are mistakes. I think they are major mistakes. And I think the frequency by which people I've known have had missing time and sort of repeated experiences, the commonality of the kind of scenario where an individual will drive from point A to point B and then suddenly find themselves back at point A, obviating the very automobile transport that they just went on. That is so commonplace. It's almost the norm now. And when it only happens once in every 20 years or once in a lifetime, that's not so concerning. But what if we began to find it commonplace that you had to make 3 attempts to drive from Philadelphia to New York City because you would keep on finding yourself back at Philadelphia after a half hour, an hour, 2 hours of driving. In other words, life could become very difficult if the time-space continuum gets so altered that the normal patterns of travel and of budgeting for things gets altered.
Well, it's not just travel; it's everything. I mean, we count on, as we said in one of the segments, I don't remember which one it was, but we count on that past, present, future. I don't know what to call it. We actually say it. We think it's a law that you can't have the present without having had the past, and you can't have the future without having had both the past and the present. So that direction is basically an ironclad rule. But if it's not an ironclad rule, and as I said, that it can be regarded as being very, very easy to change, much easier than people think. And if something like this particular premise you have is changing it, who knows what else may be out there changing the time-space continuum.